Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. We are here for our third session on the third day of our health equity fly-in, and we are examining the very important topic that was important certainly before the pandemic and had its disparities then, and is a topic that is certainly being affected by the pandemic in innumerable and important ways, and that is the topic of caregiving. And our two guests this morning are Lindsay Marshall, the Director of Advocacy and Engagement at the National Alliance for Caregiving, and Julia Barfield, who is the Senior Manager of Policy and Programs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation's Center for Education and Workforce. I would also like to introduce as a special guest our own FIU student, Ivana Kahina, who is the intern with Julia at the Centers for Education and Workforce. I would like to read a little bit about our two panelists, which I sometimes do, sometimes don't do. I think both of these bios are so fascinating and so impressive, and some of our early discussion will be about their backgrounds because of that. So Lindsay Marshall began her career as a regulatory and government affairs attorney, primarily representing the financial services industry. Her career detoured when she became a family caregiver to both parents, helping them face multiple severe illness and aging issues. During her time caregiving, she provided both care in-home and as a working long-distance caregiver. It was these experiences that ultimately inspired her to found the Kadamba Tree Foundation, a nonprofit offering education and support programs, as well as evidence-based intervention to family caregivers. She is a certified program leader for Rosalind Carter's Institute's Caring for You, Caring for Me, dealing with dementia programs. She has also been a certified interventionalist and master trainer at that institute as the same institute's resource for enhancing Alzheimer's caregivers health program. As an attorney, she's provided several hours of pro bono legal assistance to older Americans and their loved ones. In her current role, she develops advocacy infrastructure for a state and local grassroots coalition network. And Julia Barfield leads the Chamber of Commerce Foundation's early childhood education portfolio, which includes educating and engaging in business communities to invest in young children and their families. Prior to joining the Chamber Foundation, Barfield was the federal government relations manager for the Save the Children Action Network, or SCAN, and was responsible for their early childhood education portfolio. In that role, she advocated for bipartisan federal legislation to invest in early childhood education. She was a member of Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Florence response teams. Prior to Save the Children Action Network, she worked in several social service programs, including Head Start, Early Head Start, and at a youth crisis shelter where she advocated for teens in the child welfare system. So I'd like to address, before we spend most of this time with questions from our students, each of you a question about your background. Karen, as we just heard in your bio, your entree into caregiving advocacy was based on your personal experience. Would you be willing to share with us more on this insight of how you shifted your career in this direction as a result, and if and how your existing career in government affairs helped you to be effective in doing so?
Sure, Eric, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me here with you today. So yes, I was a former family caregiver, and now I am a caregiver advocate. When I was about 30, yes, I was 30 years old. It was kind of a momentous year for me. I had been out of law school for about 3 years, and I got married over the summer. And that fall, my mother was diagnosed with stomach cancer, and she, along with my dad, along with my dad, we became her primary caregivers. In my case, long distance, because I lived in Washington D.C. and they lived in Southern Virginia. During the course of my mother's illness, I helped them financially. I had a lot of out-of-pocket expenses that I helped them with, and fortunately, I was well compensated at the time, so it wasn't that much of an issue. But without my support, their cancer journey would have been a lot more difficult. And my father was a self-employed logger. He went into the woods and chopped down trees for a living, and my parents gave me a lot of grief for not going into the family business. I'm kidding, but in any event, during this time taking care of my mom, he wasn't able to work. So, it was a good thing they had me to fall back on. And I, was at a point in my career, I had a lot of leave available, and I was, because I never took vacations, I was always working. So I had stocked up a lot so I could take some time off to help my parents. And then when my mom needed some more intensive care towards the end of her life, I was able to take an extended paid leave of absence. Things got tricky for multiple reasons after she passed away. My father, within a couple of months of my mother's death, for the first time in his life, experienced chronic illness. His aorta tore. He was actually out in the woods chopping down a tree, and fortunately a neighbor came along as he was having some distress, and that triggered a whole slew of health issues. And this was a man who was in his 70s and who was stronger than most 30-year-old men, and just took a lot of pride in having a lot of strength and being able to go out and do manual labor. And suddenly his wife was taken away. His livelihood was taken away. The things that he enjoyed about life were taken away. And, and he had to manage this very complicated illness. He ended up getting a stent installed, and he had to take blood thinners to prevent having a stroke. And if you know anything about blood thinners, that's a very complicated medication. And so this is a man who never so much as had high blood pressure or any other illness, had never been on any kind of prescription his entire life, taking a very complicated drug, and his daughter was almost 4 hours away. So it was a very stressful experience for all of us. And I have no doubt that the stresses of caring for my mother took a toll on him and impacted his health. And caring for him took a toll on my health as well. And whereas I was able to manage it, my career, and my mother's illness, it wasn't easy, but I felt like I could manage it. It was very hard to manage. A second or maybe third unexpected year of caregiving, this time for my father, and the types of care that he required from me involved a lot of up and down 95. Like I said, he hadn't been someone who had needed a lot of healthcare delivery, and he just going to the doctor, going to hospital settings, that was just foreign to him. And quite frankly, he needed someone to help translate what was going on to him and help him communicate with his doctors and with his providers. So there was a lot of pressure for me to just keep going up and down 95 and be there for every single appointment. And I don't bemoan any of that, and I realized that it was necessary, but ultimately I realized that something had to give. I no longer had so much leave available. I didn't feel comfortable taking another extended family medical leave in my career, especially not that early. So I asked for an accommodation. I asked that I go to part-time, meaning instead of being in the office Monday through Friday, I would be in the office Monday through Thursday. And mind you, an attorney in a large international corporate law firm, that's still an hour of a work week of at least 50 to 60 hours. But I was willing to take a 20% pay cut and less vacation time so that I could be fully present when I was working in my career and fully present when I was caregiving with my father. I put in this request. Some weeks went by, a couple of months went by. I happened to go into the director of professional development's office about something else unrelated, and I asked her about the status of my request, and it took her completely by surprise. She's like, "What? You requested what?" The partner whom I had submitted it to, I don't know how far up the chain or if he sent it up the chain, but in any event, I made a decision at that point that I would be leaving that firm. And because I obviously had to choose between my career and caring for my father, and of course my father won. So that whole experience inspired me, and thank you for indulging me and giving you the background on all of that. But that experience, it planted a seed that, at some point in my life, I hadn't necessarily thought of myself as a caregiver before that, but having both of those experiences and having such different experiences while caring for my mother and my father planted a seed that, caregivers need some services and supports. And I had no idea whether or not they existed and what could I do to help contribute to that. And that's why I founded a local small nonprofit in the DC area. It was called Kadamba Tree Foundation, and it was named after a tree that grows in southern India. And the legend behind it is that it blossoms at the sound of monsoon thunder. And that appealed to me because that just reminded me of caregivers when I heard about it. And the organization's model drew upon evidence-based caregiver support programs that help empower caregivers and help them experience greater satisfaction in their caregiving role so that they and their families could ultimately experience better outcomes. Over the years, I worked with the National Alliance for Caregiving, and I was the caregiver who showed up to give testimony about the caregiving experience. And then a couple of years ago, this position was created in the Advocacy Department at NAC, and I thought that it would be a good opportunity to bring two sides of my experiences together. So that's a long story. Hopefully I made it short enough.
And I want to thank you for sharing those personal life details. I know that it's a lot to re-go through all of that. And I also know that a lot of students in this group are drawn to this topic through personal experience. And I like to think that we're helping train them to become policy advocates like you are. So it's very meaningful to me and to us that you're able to share that. And I think there's a unintentional but not at all surprising transition to Julia's work here, because Julia, you focus on at the Chamber Foundation, from what I can tell, at the intersection between caregiving and the workplace, which we just heard at the center of Karen's story. So Julia, I did want you to address your background a little bit too, because I know that all of your previous positions had this early childhood education focus. So I'd love to know what drew you to that, but then get straight into this topic of the intersection between caregiving and the workforce and your insights and work there.
Yeah, right as Karen was speaking, you shared your experience about your former employer. My, pulse raised a little bit of like, we got to fix that, right? Like that should not be the case especially for an educated, high earning individual, let alone, anyone for that matter. But I just had a reaction to that of like, gosh, this is exactly why I really am passionate about my job. I really stumbled into early child education prior to grad school. I was working at a youth crisis shelter. So we were a licensed group home and a drop-in shelter for runaway and homeless youth in Southern California. And, I like my job now, but that was hands down the best job I ever had. It was easily the hardest, but it was incredibly rewarding. And, we were a long-term group home. So we were primary caregivers for a lot of foster youth in the system who were stuck in the system and stuck in placement with us. So that meant going to IEP meetings, dropping off at football practices, going to court, going to the police station to pick kids up from the police station. So it meant literally just being in their lives in a way that was incredibly challenging and rewarding. And so I left that position. It was a hard decision, but I decided to go to grad school. And I had always been interested in public health. I, from just like my upbringing, I was interested in public health, but being at the youth crisis shelter, I was exposed to the mental health and trauma component of how that intersects with our individual health and well-being, but also our community health. And so I went to grad school for an MSW in social work and a master's in public health and thought, I'm going to go do advocacy within the foster care system. I was really passionate about what I saw, and the intersection of social determinant of health and how kids were faring in the foster care system or not faring well. And so I got to grad school and I got a placement in a Head Start program, which was not what I thought. If you're familiar with Head Start, it's an early childhood program. It's funded by the federal government. It's for low-income families. So it's, caring for kids from 6 weeks to 5 years old and really being responsible for their education. It's a holistic program. So it's really focused on high quality parent engagement. It's really connecting with families to help them improve their economic stability. But in all honesty, I was really mad. I was like, this is not what I came to grad school for. This is not what I'm paying thousands of dollars for. I really, I'm not interested in this aspect of work. But I had an awesome supervisor who really helped educate me on all of the ways that we can do early intervention for kids and families, how we can support parents with these programs where you have high visibility into family needs. You're working with their kid, but you understand what's happening at home with how their kids are talking about what's happening at home. You understand if someone loses a job. You understand if they're having problems accessing, TANF money for that month. And so it was a way for me to connect with families that I had gotten from my previous work and understand that, we could mitigate some of the things that I saw. It's not like we're going to prevent everything. We can't change life from happening to kids, right? But interventions with a 4-year-old is a lot cuter than it is with a 14-year-old. And I saw how the system treats a 14-year-old, right? And doesn't care well for them. And so I thought if there was an opportunity for us to really prevent a lot of that, that trauma and pain in a family happening, early child education is a great start. And so I could talk about it all day, but I was in grad school and I realized I didn't want to work in a program. I had done that previously. And as much as I liked working with families, I really wanted to change the way that we finance the system and make investments strategically, either through the state or federal government. And so what I did, because I didn't have policy experience, is I just dedicated all of my projects in grad school to understanding policy, understanding financing systems. And so my poor professors, every paper, I just turned it into an early childhood project, right? It was I took that opportunity to learn the skills that I needed for research or analysis or policy proposal writing, and just got to know the literature on early child education. And so it set me up into a position where I was connected with Save the Children Action Network through another colleague that I knew. So, it was someone in my network who helped me get a position on the government relations team at SCAN. And from there, then a lobbyist position opened up. So what I think really helped me in getting that lobbyist position, because in all honesty, I was underqualified, skill-wise. I'd never gone to the Hill. I'd never lobbied any congressional members' staff, but I knew the policy better than anyone else on that team. And I really focused on, I was the only person on that team who had ever gone to a DSS office with a family member. And so when I was going into, members of Congress's offices to talk with their staff, it was very easy for me to draw from this personal experience and say, we've got some gaps in how we fund this, right? I've gone with a dad to go get his DSS dollars so that he could bring his child to early Head Start, and, they didn't have his money. And so his kid was not going to program and he lost his job. That is a very, that's not my personal experience, but I was in a position where no one on my team had any type of personal connections. And then any, Hill staff, no offense, they're fresh out of college, and that's totally fine if that's what you want to be. I mean, it's not a judgment by any means, but I think it was really helpful for me to have dedicated some time to understanding the people that I was then advocating for. So it feels a lot more personal in that I can see how policy changes would impact people's lives in a different way.
So I'm glad you share that perspective on lobbying. I do, being a career development-oriented person in DC, follow a lot of lobbying job postings and a lot of the job switching that lobbyists I might be connected to on LinkedIn are doing. And there does often seem to be a preference for lobbying experience over expertise or personal experience with the topic you'd be lobbying about. And I think when somebody is lobbying based on something they're an expert in and have a connection to, that turns lobbying into a positive thing rather than a thing to be maligned, because that's democracy in action, when somebody who knows what they're talking about and cares about an issue is able to affect policy on it. I want to ask both of you, and Julia, feel free to make sure that the workforce angle of your work comes up here, because I'm sure it will. What this seminar is really about is the impact of the pandemic and the election. So what are the disparities in caregiving? How has COVID affected those? And how might what we learn about the impact of this election affect the work that you're doing? And go back to Karen and then back to you, Julie, on that.
Sure. From the caregiving perspective, caregiving was very difficult before COVID, and it continues to be. COVID has amplified the situation. In many ways, it's pulled a curtain back so that more people know what caregiving is. A lot of caregivers themselves didn't necessarily identify their roles as something, as a particular, a special role. They just knew they're someone's spouse, someone's daughter, someone's son, and they're usually just performing some type of duty in relation to help with that relationship or because they're in that relationship. But the pandemic has put a spotlight on the challenges that caregivers face as far as juggling their caregiving, especially with juggling their caregiving responsibilities with the need to work. Because now, of course, we see people who are trying to school their children, give full-time care to their children while also caring for, while also doing their jobs, sometimes remotely, sometimes still having to go outside of their homes to do so. And as we look at a lot of the relief that came out in the COVID packages over the summer, I'm sure you're aware that paid leave was among some of the supports that that have been extended. However, they don't, a noticeable absence is having some type of relief for people who are having to juggle having to work at home while also caring for an older adult who is no longer able to get respite care outside of the home because of shutdowns, or has no longer able to, it's no longer safe for them to be in a facility to be cared for. So that's really just amplified and increased amplify the existing burdens on caregivers and also increase the complexity of their situation. As you are probably also aware, many people have also not been able to or have not felt comfortable going into providers to get their healthcare needs met because of the pandemic, either because there were shutdowns at first and now that things have opened up more, there's still some discomfort. That means a lot of conditions are not being treated. And that means that caregivers, family caregivers are at home trying to fill in gaps in services and ensure continuity of care without necessarily having the same type of access or not feeling like they have the same type of access to the healthcare providers. And down the line, that just increases caregiving responsibilities, especially for those who, those many family caregivers who provide complex medical and nursing tasks for the people that they care for and love. And there was a second part to the question. Maybe you could remind me what that was, Eric.
Perhaps more controversial one of how this election might affect your advocacy work.
So we're certainly concerned about what will ultimately happen with the Affordable Care Act. This kind of predated my tenure with NAC, but the Affordable Care Act was something that did receive organization support. And so we're obviously concerned with any changes in how that could affect people's ability to afford care, because when the individual can't afford care, a lot of times the family caregivers must step up to help fill in any gaps and help make sure that people are able to pay for the medications they need, or able to get the services they need to experience well-being. So we're definitely looking at that. We're also interested, should the election go to Joe Biden, some of you may be aware that he introduced as part of his platform the 21st Century Caregiving and Education Workforce. Fortifying the caregiving infrastructure across the country is a priority of ours, because professionals such as the home health care aides, I'm thinking of the direct care workers who are paid to come in to help families and support the unpaid family caregivers who are caring for their loved ones. They provide some very important help. They allow family caregivers to be able to continue working. They allow family caregivers to be able to take moments of respite to recharge themselves so that they can remain strong and resilient in their roles. So having a strong and sufficiently educated and compensated direct care workforce ultimately benefits caregivers. And his platform proposes $775 billion to fortify caregiving. So obviously, we're interested in, should he be elected, how that will ultimately be designed and rolled out. And just in general, the issues that we're interested in are paid leave for family caregivers. As from my own story, you could probably see how that would be useful to lots of caregivers, regardless of what type of employment that they have. So we are interested in seeing how support around paid family leave which exists, and it's grown a lot in recent years with respect to the beginning of life. So paid leave for new parents to be able to take care of their newborn children, for instance, that's something that's garnering a lot of bipartisan support. What isn't necessarily getting as much support is extending the same types of protections and policies to caregivers towards the end of life. So our position is that people should not have to make the decision between caring for themselves and caring for their families. And that's true across the lifespan.
Thank you, Karen. Julia?
Yeah, so similar to what Karen said, there were many challenges and honestly, like a childcare crisis and to be truthful, of access to high quality, affordable care prior to the pandemic. And what we've seen since the pandemic, we've seen in many, many other issues in this country, is that it has exacerbated what was happening before. So we had an issue of lack of supply of childcare. About 51% of people in this country live in what's called a childcare desert. That means that we've got 3 children to every 1 childcare slot. So that's like, we call that just a space. So, a supply issue. We also had an affordability issue in that, you've got 18 years and a bunch of tax credits and loan opportunities to save for college. And yet for, new families, you don't have hardly any of that. There are some tax credits. There is state and federal assistance for certain low-income families, but you have to be very, very low income, and it doesn't cover the full cost of care. So we had the onus then for affordability was on parents. And so we had not only an access issue, but an affordability issue as well. And similar to, exposure for vulnerable older adults, for young children and families that were being asked to go back to work. There was a lot of fear for, the kids of essential workers to bring their child to a center where there's a lot of exposure to kids, to teachers, and you're being asked to go back to work, right, as an essential worker, and yet you don't know what to do with your child to keep them safe, to keep yourself safe. So we have seen that the pandemic, I don't think is a surprise to anyone, is disproportionately impacting those who are essential workers, who tend to be lower income. It's disproportionately impacting women and disproportionately impacting people of color. So, when you think about employers and the role that they can play, we obviously want to see employers not only recognize the need of their working parents. I think it's one thing that you're in my home. So I think we can kind of pull back the curtain, to use Karen's phrasing, of, we're seeing what's happening at home for families in a new way. And for those who are privileged enough to be able to work from home, I think employers are recognizing, oh, there are 4-year-olds jumping in Zoom calls, or I have to turn off my video because, I have to feed my kid. And I think there's a level of transparency there. I think for those who are being essential workers, we're still a little bit hiding what the balance is that they're juggling, right? Because they are going into work, but yet they're also trying to figure out, do I bring my child to, someone's like, this is like so real, right? You're turning off your camera to feed your child too. But so we definitely are seeing the pandemic impacting different groups more intensely than others. At the same time, we have seen employers recognize this in a new way. We did the survey in August of employers, and we found that 92% of employers said that they were aware of their working parents' childcare needs. So I don't have that data point prior to the pandemic, but I can guarantee you it was not 92%. Whether that means they're acting on that or not is a different story, but I think having a level of awareness and acknowledgement is a really important first step, and one that we're encouraged by. I think now the next step is to say, so what are you going to do about it as an employer? And there are options, for sure. I think from employer perspectives, oftentimes they see this as like an HR benefit. So whether that's, elder support or childcare support, I think a lot of employers see like what types of benefits do we give for folks, which does get a little complicated. I can't weigh in on policy necessarily, but in whatever administration we do have, the approach looks very differently, in all honesty. And so we want to see more employers actively engaged in part of the solution, rather than expecting that parents will take care of that on their own. We do want to see them make some investments on their own. And I think we're in such a tough position, right? Because we're like kind of all just waiting to see what comes in the next couple of days, but there will be different responses from either administration. We do see Congress has a very important role to play, and we focused on building more bipartisan champions for this issue because it has been typically received bipartisan support. So depending on if there's an administration change or not, it looks like maybe at least the Senate will stay with Republican majority. So we will have to continue to build bipartisan support for this issue. It feels like there's a lot unknown. So maybe if I'm stumbling, it's because I'm like, I don't know the world that we're going to have in a week. But yeah, I am encouraged to see so many employers who are calling us and saying, I was not aware of this issue before. This is a concern. We're hearing it from our employees, and we hope that that trend continues.
It looks like there are some questions, so I'm going to turn it over to the students to keep things going. Chloe?
Hello, Karen and Julia. Thank you so much for being here today. I unfortunately missed the first 10 minutes of this dialogue, but just popping in, I felt very touched by what I was hearing. I grew up watching my mom take care of my grandmother through cancer and surgery, and then later on my parents had to step in for a sibling of mine, and with the election highlighting how I think there's like a preference for self-care over a celebration and nurturing of what it means to be a caregiver. It's a culture that's starting to be diminished and almost criticized. Are there any programs or any forms of policy that I could be aware of that are working to incentivize those who are giving care, or offering incentives to companies and corporations who are working towards expanding what they offer as far as those who have to take care of their parents or siblings and children moving forward?
So I'll jump in on that. So there are a lot of evidence-based and evidence-informed programs that get to the need that you just described, caregivers being able to stay healthy so that they can continue providing care for their families. And when I say family caregivers, I just want to make a quick note that we really mean family and friend caregivers, because family can include families of choice. So it's any situation where someone's providing unpaid care to an older adult or someone with a chronic illness or disability. With respect to the types of evidence-based programs and evidence-informed programs that I just described, there aren't really any official or government incentives for employers necessarily that I'm aware of to offer those types of programs across the entire lifespan. However, there are some important infrastructures in place that provide those programs independent of employers. So there's the National Family Caregiver Support Program, which is a program that helps older Americans stay at home and supports their families and helping them to stay at home. So that would be an example of one program that people may be eligible for, that they could get the types of supports that you described. Also within the VA system, the VA's caregiver support program provides a range of different services and supports to help family caregivers in that respect, from their own well-being and health to also even giving them education support around financial planning and legal planning. But in terms of a large infrastructure that incentivizes the types of programs that you're describing, there are employers who do take those initiatives on their own, but in terms of just having some type of incentive for them to offer those particular programs, I'm not aware of any on a large scale nationally.
Yeah, I'll give you just like a very brief overview, but I did just ask Ivana to do this really fun project, which was to look at all of the bills in the 116th Congress that pertain to early child education. So I would definitely point you to reach out to her if you want those resources. She did a great job. But it was, it was a fun task, I'm sure. So we fund childcare in this country by a main block grant. It's called the Child Care and Development Block Grant. And if you're not familiar with what a block grant is, it's where the federal government gives a chunk of funds to states. That chunk is determined, it's called a formula. It depends on, population, median income, but so every year Congress decides if they're going to increase that amount or not through what's called an appropriations process. All of this is just like big words that mean we're going to increase funding. And so every year there's an opportunity to advocate for increase in funding if that's of interest to you. There are, as I said, this is an issue that has had a lot of bipartisan support. So there are a lot of bills that have been introduced in both the Senate and the House who, that focus on improving the system. Because as I said earlier, there definitely were some gaps in how we fund childcare. If you're interested, obviously I would be more than happy to talk deeper dive, but that's just basically like, we can increase funding, or as Karen mentioned, under the Biden administration, he did put forth a pretty comprehensive plan that would overhaul how we fund childcare. So, there could be a potential significant increase in childcare funding. If that happens, I think is one thing, given, both the election and then Congress. I think when that happens is another conversation, but I'm really encouraged by, how vocal advocates and grassroots supporters can be. So I think if these are things that are personally important to you, I would really encourage you to vocalize that, because I do think that we have a lot more power than we think when it comes to vocalizing, to elected officials, what we care about.
Great, and I'm glad you brought up appropriations, because my since the pandemic project, a few minutes a day, has been putting together an online course on federal government policymaking and policy advocacy, which has tons of resources on the federal budget process. And our fly-in groups are the first FIU students to have access to this brand new course to prepare for DC internships and careers. So I hope the group takes advantage of learning more about that topic that you brought up.
That's awesome. That's really cool. And knowing that now Congress is doing, they're breaking all their own rules. So
yes, it has what the process is supposed to look like and what it often does look like instead. I saw some hands go up and down. Rumi, did you still have a question?
Hi, Karen and Julia. So my question got kind of answered by what Chloe asked earlier. But I am a fourth year doctoral student in public health, and my interest really kind of aligns with both of your fields. And my focus of my research is parents of children with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their mental health. So that's a lifetime of caregiving, and employment opportunities get affected because they have to then provide childcare on a consistent basis. And so opportunities kind of limit themselves because of that obstacle and barrier that they face with providing that care. So one of the questions that I had, and like Chloe asked already, was how has there anything been done in terms of thinking about caregiving and childcare that has to work in tandem across the lifespan for a child that's going to live with their family perpetually? So it doesn't really fall into the child scenario where we think about someone from 0 to 12 years old per se, but it's more across the lifespan, and it's going to be a continued issue rather than something that's going to improve or change or, you know, cease to exist at some point.
Yeah, I mean, Karen, feel free to jump in here. This is definitely not my area of expertise. So just total warning on that. But I would say I am not aware of anything. And I think that's because we fund systems in different ways, and we see them as, you know, a child is in childcare, which is mostly private businesses. So we fund that in one way. And then they enter the school system. And of course, you know, there's legislation for the supports that they can get. But then they enter the school system and then they graduate from our formal schooling. And I think families are left grasping at straws, right? And so I think one of the biggest challenges with where our policies are is that we don't look at individuals holistically. We do see like, what system are you working in? Even though we all know that, you know, people do not exist in a vacuum, right? Like I interact with a lot of different systems, but none of them talk to each other and none of them share any of my data, which, you know, that's another conversation. But like, there's not, if I'm accessing some resources, no one else is communicating about that. So I think long-winded way of saying, no, I'm not aware of it. But Karen, go ahead and jump in if you're more familiar.
So, well, I'm not sure how much more familiar I am, or at least with respect to the entire lifespan. And that goes to a point that you made. As far as systems that serve the entire lifespan and take into the fact that lives and people evolve over time and care needs evolve over time, that really does not exist. Services and supports for caregivers are very siloed in this country. Caregivers must navigate different types of different agencies, different organizations, depending on not only their needs, but the age of who they're caring for. And if they're caring for someone from childhood through adulthood, that just makes it even more complex. So I appreciate the question, as I do all of the other questions that have been asked today. And I think the sort of not a direct answer to this, but the issue that needs to be addressed and what we need is exactly what Julia was getting at. There needs to be some infrastructure that addresses and provides these supports across the lifespan. I'll add that a couple of years ago, Congress passed the Raised Family Caregiver Advisory Council, RAISE being standing for Recognize, Assist, Include, Support, and Engage Family Caregivers. And that includes that created an advisory council with federal and non-federal members that are charged with developing a national strategy to address caregiving. And that includes things like their wellness and their well-being, how they're educated and prepared for their caregiving roles, as well as financial security for them, among other priorities. And one of the big successes that we see potentially coming out of this group is that, you know, caregiving issues, I should back up and maybe note that caregiving policies tend to, formal caregiving policies, meaning they are backed by some government regulation or statute, either at the state or the federal level, tend to be very aging network focused, like the National Family Caregiver Support Program that I mentioned a little while ago. That originates out of the Aging Network to help older Americans stay at home. We've been following and helping to inform the work of the Raised Family Caregiver Advisory Council, and I'll note that the members of this council are recognizing that caregiving is a continuum. Caregiving occurs across different phases of life, when you're talking about the individual caregiver themselves or the person that they're caring for. So we're hopeful that the national strategy that eventually comes out of this council will include more of a lifespan focus and will lead to the development of a stronger national infrastructure that supports all types of caregivers.
Can I add one more thing just quickly? Because Rumi, I think one thing that, you know, it feels like Karen and I are both at a loss for federal ideas or innovation, but I think there are some exciting things that are happening at the local and state level that I think often get missed, and we have an opportunity to replicate potentially at the federal level. This doesn't have to do with children with disabilities, but in San Diego, there's a group called San Diego Workforce Partnership, very cool organization. And one thing that they have been doing over the past, I want to say 18 months, don't quote me on that, but they have been trying to create a data share agreement between childcare subsidies, workforce training programs, and child support agencies, so that if, for example, you owe child support, but you're in a workforce training program, they don't want to just like take some of your wages, like garner your wages as you're trying to, like, they don't want it to be punitive. And so they're trying to have this holistic group where they're seeing the same families interact with one or multiple groups, like within those three agencies, so that if you are trying to go to a workforce training program but don't have access to childcare, you're automatically flagged in the childcare subsidy system. Or if you owe childcare support but you don't have a job, you're flagged within the workforce training system. And so I think some of those innovative ways to look at individuals who are interacting with the same systems over and over again could be a way for us to learn more about, you know, how to replicate innovative, you know, holistic policy making.
Great. Thank you so much, Julia and Karen.
Thank you both. We do have time for Ian's final question before you transition into prep for our Hill visits and policy hack. Chloe, if you wanted to jump in with your text comment as part of the conversation before Ian's question, I love that this is a dialogue and you're welcome to do so.
Okay, I'll keep it short, but again, I just want to say thank you both for being here today, because I just feel like there's such a divide and a lessening of what it means to be a caregiver, and offering resources to be able to sustain those around you beyond yourself. And I believe that as the topic continues to come up through policy, the how we view the topic of caregiving itself will begin to expand and grow from a place of love, not just self-love, but community-based love and care.
Thanks, Chloe. Last question to Ian.
Thank you. Both Karen and Julia, thank you so much for sharing your inspirational public health stories as well. I've been kind of dropping in and out of this call because I'm in like I've got both my kids on Zoom calls. They're having things going on. My wife is on her own like important Zoom call. And so they handed me the puppy and a whole bunch of things. My question is actually around school policy here in Miami-Dade County in Florida. You know, we've seen a really a big push by the governor of our state to drive schooling to basically open almost like as a daycare center to ensure that more essential workers and people can get in and go to work and kind of like rebuild the economy. And so, you know, I'm very privileged to be able to work from home, my wife as well. So what I'm more concerned about are what you guys mentioned in COVID in terms of how, you know, essential workers are basically forced to send their kids back to school. In a way, those kids are more exposed to, you know, coronavirus related things than other kids. They have to sit in the classes. In Florida, teachers are not even really allowed to interact with them. We've got kind of like major issues here. So mine was really about the election and whether or not a new administration can really change things in terms of pressure from a state governor or a governor's office. So our governor puts a lot of pressure on the school board and even like threatens reducing funding to schools and certain things in order to make sure schools start opening in person, which again can expose kids to risk. So, is there a way to advocate, or is there a way in a new administration, if it is Biden who, seems likely now to become the president-elect, can that change Florida, or are we still kind of at a dead end in terms of the amount of pressure the governor will continue to kind of adopt his herd immunity strategy for coronavirus?
Yeah, so one thing that I have really focused on during the pandemic, and we will continue to focus on as a team, is that the majority of care in this country is done by private owned businesses. These are, your childcare center down the street. These are, a woman out of her home that's licensed offering care for young children. And the majority of these businesses are very small. They are predominantly owned by women, many of whom are women of color. And so I think when you're talking to a governor or elected officials who are trying to reopen the state, I think it's super important to recognize that if we just add childcare into our school system, you are actually potentially putting nearly 700,000 businesses out of business. It's a pretty lucrative industry. I don't think a lot of people realize, and I don't say lucrative in that everyone's making money off of it, but it's a crucial driver to our own economy. It's roughly $47 billion a year generated in revenue from these small business owners. And so what we're really advocating for on the chamber side is to see direct support to those providers. Because even let's pretend there's a Biden administration, and now I'm jumping a little bit into policy, which I'm not legally allowed to do, but let's go for it. We really want to see the fact that, yes, you can overhaul the system, but at the end of the day, if you overhaul the system and it hurts what we currently have, especially the entrepreneurs and business owners whose livelihoods depend on staying open, then I guess we have to ask the question, was that worth it? And so I do think there's a way where we could see significant changes to the system and keep our current supply. But I think right now, in any conversations we're having, whether it's with electeds, whether it's with business leaders, there is a system that already exists around us, and we need to ensure that it doesn't get destroyed from the pandemic, so that we're just starting from scratch. And I do think, for a lot of folks who are pushing to reopen states or reopen schools, there are reasons for that. But at the end of the day, you're also potentially putting a ton of people out of work in that effort if you just move all childcare to a school system. And so maybe that's the argument for people to hear, that you can't, you can't push for schools to take it over. The only other thing I would say is that in states where we have seen state-funded pre-K, let's care for a 4 and a 5-year-old, but what happens is you pull those 4 and 5-year-olds out of your, childcare center down the street, and the cost of caring for a, kid birth to 3 skyrockets exponentially. And it, without that happening, it already costs more than, college tuition for public schools in most states. So we're potentially creating a bigger problem with a solution that isn't necessarily looking at the system. The last thing I'll say, and I feel like I'm just on a soapbox here, is that we did some surveys prior to the pandemic in 4 states to look at the economic impact of childcare breakdowns to both businesses and the economy. And we were very strategic in asking the question is, if you leave work for, because of caregiving needs, what age was your child when you chose to leave work? And almost 100% of working parents said they left when their kid was under the age of 3. And so again, when we think about policy solutions, we have to recognize who are our most vulnerable parents, and for an employer, who's at risk of potentially leaving and whose job I'm going to have to fill. It's not when your child's 4 or 5, because I'm sure it's, there's still exhaustion, but there's a light at the end of the tunnel, right? It's when you're coming back from leave, or you don't have leave, and you're cobbling together care and you're exhausted. And so maybe that would be some helpful information for you to share with the governor. But I really do think we have a lot of, yes, there's a lot that is coming from governors, and there's obviously, we're looking to the federal government for another COVID relief package, but I do think we have a lot of agency to say how governors spend money, what they're pushing for. And so maybe I'm just trying to feel hopeful, but I'll stop rambling. Go ahead, Karen.
Well, I don't know that I can comment specifically on the politics of reopening, but I will say that there a clear role that we see from our work's perspective for federal government is having issuing clear statements about the public health implications about what's happening, and issuing understandable guidance on how to deal with this pandemic and what it means for different communities. Not too long ago, we had a meeting with a group of young adult caregivers talking about their experiences around caregiving, and of course COVID came up. And one of those people was a young woman who was, I think she was probably in her late 20s, and she's a public school teacher, and she also cares for her father, who has been diagnosed with a chronic illness, and he's at home. And so this was, I want to say, the middle of the summer, before a lot of places, and definitely not schools, had reopened, but she was very concerned about her school district reopening, not just because she was concerned about her students, which she definitely was, but she also had to keep in mind the fact that she was going home to her father, and if proper precautions weren't taken, it would impact him. And I think we need to remember that, we don't just have the people in front of us as we see them. A lot of people are caregivers and we don't even know it. We don't know if the essential worker that we come across during our day, we don't know if that person goes home to someone with an underlying condition that puts them at greater risk. So having clear guidance, having effective guidance that people can embrace and understand over how to cope during this pandemic can go a long way with helping people and helping jurisdictions, regardless of how they decide to reopen, whether or not they decide to reopen, to be able to open as safely as possible, regardless of what they do.
Karen, Julia, thank you so much for taking an hour of your time to discuss this with us. And Ivana, thank you so much for your assistance in making it happen and for being here. I look forward to staying in touch with both of you and your organizations as we do our student programming around topics like this. It was a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to have the students stay on this call. There will be some time to grab something to eat while you're working in your groups, but we're going to immediately transition to Carlos doing some preparation for congressional visits, and then myself setting up our policy presentation activities. So hang on right here.
And thank you, Julie and Karen. Thank you.
Carlos, you want to take it over first for Hill visit prep?
Sure. Do I have sharing rights?
Yeah.
Very good, very good. All right, gang. Hi, good morning again, or good afternoon. No new states